Welcome, Lesley, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm so pleased to have you as my guest today. Do you want to introduce yourself to listeners, give a bit of a flavour of your background and how you got to doing what you're doing today?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Um, okay, so I'm Lesley Cooper. I run a company called WorkingWell, which has been doing work in the wellbeing and performance space since, I'm frightened to say, mid 80s probably. So, getting on for 30 years. And my background, the business background for all of us really was in private healthcare initially, working for at that time, the UK's leading private healthcare company, who were surprisingly for the healthcare company really focused very much on sickness at that time. So there's a lot of focus on trying to put a proposition together for the market that would help companies get a little bit more proactive rather than just kind of treating people when they became unwell, but to understand a little bit about what we might be able to do upstream of that. And by a rather convoluted route, we finished up perhaps, coming at it from a position of trying to manage sickness absence to understanding what is it actually that makes people stay away from work. That these are, it's the word malingering was used a lot in the late 80s, that people didn't come to work because they were malingering. The reality of it is that people don't come to work for a variety of different reasons, but a lot of them are what we would now understand to be psychosocial. They're not happy. There's something going on in the workplace, some toxicity there that gets in the way of the normal behavior, which is to attend. We are, as a species, we're mission driven. We like having things to do. We need the lights. We need a certain amount of stimulation and engagement to function. So when people don't go to work, there's lots and lots of reasons why that might in fact be what might be getting in the way of them wanting to attend. So I eventually, after the birth of my second child, left corporate land and started to do work as a consultant in this space. And 25, 30 years later, the penny has dropped. People understand the relationship between employee well-being, attendance, and performance. And, being also not just like being in the chair, but being fully present and engaged, and just, how that is a win-win. When people love their job, they're fully engaged, they're fully present, they're creative, they're enthusiastic, they're excited about their work, they're happy. When they're not, they're not. Something
Yeah,
quite different is going on.
yeah,
And that is the case for many people. You can see that in the stress statistics
yeah,
now.
yeah. And what are the statistics? What are the sort of numbers you're talking about in relation to stress and people who maybe are not that very much engaged at work?
Well, the numbers, the numbers in terms of direct cost of sickness absence are huge. I mean, in the billions. I think what's happened with sickness absence though is that people don't go off sick. They go, they're present at work, physically present at work, but they're not necessarily contributing in the way that they might otherwise be if the toxicity that they're struggling with or whatever else is going on culturally in their workplace was different. So they're in the chair. Presenteeism, as it was called then, is still a thing. But I think because we all operate in a kind of do more with less world now, people just don't necessarily stay away from the workplace, but they attend. But it gets harder and harder for people who are not comfortable in their work environment to actually be able to contribute at the level that's required, and therefore that kind of sets up this rather difficult cycle of you have to go but you don't want to go. When you get there, you can't function in the way that you want to. So
Yeah,
it's changed.
yeah.
Now, the
So
costs are invisible now.
yeah,
I guess
well,
that's the difference.
I was about to ask that actually. Yeah, so it seems so you have these numbers associated, say, with stress, and it's costing the economy, not just individual companies, but it's costing the economy in the billions. But actually, if someone is showing up to work, but they're not really performing at their best, they're not really that into it, for want of a better word, they're not performing to the level that the company needs, but maybe they don't even realize that the person's not performing because they're there and they're doing the work, but they're not, interestingly, and I keep referring back to the statistic, but I did put a poll. It's not exactly scientific, but I put a poll on LinkedIn last year and I asked people whether they were realizing their full potential at work, and 80% of people said no. It was more than 80% actually. And I was shocked by that statistic, and I kind of work in this area, and even I was shocked by that number. I suppose coming back to the idea, like you're saying that the reasons are, they tend to be psychosocial. Um, and you said there's lots of reasons, and maybe there's too many to name them all. But Can we talk about a few of the reasons that people might not be, they might be showing up to work but not necessarily fully engaged?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex area. Put simply, I mean, pressure is everywhere, isn't it? And so people respond to pressure in completely different ways. So because we're in an environment where people need to do more with less, what happens when you put human beings under consistent pressure to achieve more with less and less, is that they eventually check out emotionally. And there's a kind of defense mechanism in that, because we like to win. We are mission driven. You need a certain amount of success. You need to feel that you've made a contribution. You need to feel that you've achieved something. And what happens is, if the bar keeps moving upwards, it's as fast as you actually get to a point where you feel you've made that contribution. It moves on again. And also because everyone is so busy, and the pressure to perform and meet multiple demands is so intense that and we're all guilty of this, we've lost the time, the bandwidth to be able to celebrate success, recognize each other, recognize the contribution already made. We're already on to the next thing. Success is almost taken as a non-event, and it's really about, yeah, we know about that, but what's next? So pressure is to some extent the big factor in the background, because it's universal and it comes from everywhere, and people respond to that in different ways. And there is a sweet spot. People can tend to think pressure and stress are the same thing. They're completely different things. Pressure is an input, and it's universal. It's everywhere. It comes from multiple sources. But stress is only one outcome. The other one is growth, happiness, satisfaction, engagement, all the good stuff. A bit like Goldilocks porridge, really. There's a perfect temperature. And when pressure is at a level that is within our coping strategy, perhaps even a tiny bit beyond it, we get this kind of stretch zone thing going on, which is where growth happens. That's where our satisfaction is often at our highest, and we feel that we're contributing and truly alive. You may even want to stand on the desk and sing the company song. It's a good feeling. But if your coping strategies don't develop at the same rate as the pressure, if one gets ahead of the other, which is actually the norm, because pressure keeps on increasing, as we say, that bar keeps moving forward, then you get to a situation where stretch turns into strain, and then that's kind of a different feeling altogether. So to answer your question, there's pressure. Understand the difference between pressure and stress, and recognizing, and we can come back to this if we have time, I guess, that there are many things that individuals can do to manage their own personal resources, so that pressure hits them in a way that enables them to grow and learn from it. Anecdotally, put a saddle and reins on it, and it can take you somewhere, as opposed to kind of trample over you and give you a broken leg. Yeah. So there are definitely things that are within the gift of the individual to be able to manage that interface and get the good outcomes and not the stress one. But of course, we're all swimming in a pond. So that's, if you see that as the fish, okay, there's lots of fish swimming around. What's going on in the water that we're all swimming around in? So fish have obligations to look after themselves, perhaps, but we might also need to think about who's maintaining the pond. And it seems to us at the moment that one of the biggest things that people could attend to is how psychologically safe people feel at work, because happiness at work is often rooted in feeling that you are free and safe to be yourself. It's exhausting pretending to be someone else every day. Yeah. And actually, from a performance point of view, companies have much to gain by enabling people to feel that it's okay to be me, that I'm valued as me, that my opinion is worth something, and that it's okay for me to use a voice. And that people are genuinely interested in my opinion, even if it's different to their own. And of course, the reality is that isn't what happens in most cases. We need to take into personal risks with people every day, and we assess it really, really quickly. If I say this, what will happen? What will people think about me if I say this? What will the consequences be? And because of our ancestry, we'll default to sense of threat always, looking for danger. So if there's any doubt that this is not going to land well, or people will think I'm silly if I say this, or I've got this really brilliant idea, but I think people might think I'm a bit, what is she on? Maybe I won't say. And you think about that across a corporation, the cost of that in itself, in terms of good ideas not expressed, would be a reason on its own to think about whether how safe our people feel to be themselves and express themselves here. But of course, it's creating a psychologically safe culture is not something you can do on a Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah.
You can start work on a Tuesday afternoon. You can decide as the leader, we want one of these, but we're all stakeholders in it, and we all have to do something to create one. So there's two things. It's like the external pressure, which is perhaps for an individual to think about how they respond to things, but there's also that kind of bigger picture of what's going on in the pond.
So it's the kind of the individual and the environment. I'd love to take those three different aspects that I've picked up and kind of look at them in isolation and then maybe as a whole as well. But this idea of pressure as the input and stress or growth as the output. So those as kind of two separate things. And then talking about psychological safety. How do we get there? What's getting in the way of leaders, or why would a leader decide that it's not a good thing to have? So maybe we start with this idea of pressure. And something that occurred to me is there's the pressure that's put on you, but there's also this pressure that we put on ourselves to perform, or we have this certain persona that we've created, or we have this perception of ourselves of what we should be able to do. And you know, linking back to psychological safety, if we feel like we can't do something and we're afraid to speak up and share that we can't necessarily achieve what we've agreed to achieve, or achieve what's maybe expected of us, that, you know, there's that fear associated with that as well. So can we talk more about the pressure, and where does this pressure come from, and this, you know, trying to get more done in less time? And I've always been really interested in this concept of productivity. Something I've become more aware of recently is the importance of saying no to things, even if you want to do them, because you simply don't have enough time to get everything done in a day. And, you know, for me especially, and I spoke at an event yesterday evening, and everyone shared the same thing. You have so many things on your to-do list, and it's never ending. The more stuff you do, the more stuff you have to do, and it just leads on and on and on. And there comes a point where you just have to start saying no and really prioritizing what is it that you really want. And I know certainly before we started recording, the example that we were kind of talking about was this idea of wanting to spend time with your children, or go to a match or something like that, that's not work related, but it maybe encroaches in work time. So let's have a chat about this, the idea of pressure. Where does this come from? You know, the external, the internal pressures we put on ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the external pressures are there environmentally, aren't they? If you have a job, people expect things from you. There's roles to be fulfilled. There are responsibilities. There are relationships you need to manage. And there is this just sort of never-ending cycle of, you know, when you climb the mountain of work, there's another one just over there, or you get to the top and say, oh, sorry, wrong mountain. We need to go on to this one now. So, you know, external work demands, absolutely, they're always there. And, you know, our organizations are resourced in a very specific way now, which, you know, personally, I think often trades on the goodwill of the staff, you know, the ability to find this extra capacity from somewhere, which, as we know, is often stolen in practical terms from recovery time, you know, time with friends, family, just not working, and extending the working day is often the way that we respond to those demands, those external demands. But you're completely right, that internal demands, and we could talk for weeks about this, are almost as powerful, in fact, perhaps more so, because they're related to the external demands. So, you know, human beings are natural storytellers, as I'm sure you all know. You know, the way our brains make sense of the world is to take the stimulus and kind of categorize it into things you know about, things you don't know about, you know, distort things to make them fit patterns, delete things you don't think are relevant, so that you can actually speed up the processing. So we do that by telling stories. You know, something happens, go, I know about this. Something similar happened before, and that's a very efficient processing method. But the unfortunate thing is we get stuck in narratives. So we, you know, things happen, and we don't necessarily think about how we respond to it, because our internal narrative tells us we need to do this or that, where there may not be any evidence actually that we have to do this or we have to do that. So as you've rightly said, if you experiment with, okay, stimulus response, small gap, before I agree to this, check the story. What am I telling myself about the consequences of not doing this? And actually, what people do is, I don't have time for that, which is true, which is why we tend to default to do what we always do, which is why we get what we always get, of course. But we're running constant internal stories that kind of keep us in the same place. And part of the challenge of becoming more resilient actually is to recognize that you have internal narratives, and just stop now and again and listen to them and say, hang on though, is there a choice here? Could I do something different? They're incredibly powerful for keeping you in the same place. And actually, a lot of the time when you say, where's the evidence for not being able to choose a different response, you can't come up with it. There's a feeling about it that it's, oh, it'll just be easier if I do it myself. I've heard this so many times, and we're all guilty, even though we know the theory, still do it. It's like, I know that I'm actually extending my range of things I have to get on with into things that other people could help me with, or in fact should perhaps have more responsibility for than I, but you'll still do it because it just feels quicker to do that. So the more under pressure you are, the more inclined you are to keep doing what you always do. And if you're a fixer, you'll just do it yourself. So those internal stories are like really, really, really important. And sometimes they work brilliantly for you. Some internal stories that are built around, I can do this. Yes, I can be brave. I can, I've got this. I'm uncomfortable, but I'm going to feel the fear and do it anyway. Some of those stories are really helpful, but not all of them. And so there's something around checking in with yourself on a regular basis to see what you're telling yourself about this, because that's why the work pressures can accumulate, because you'll tell yourself that it's not possible for me to go to the gym, or it's not possible for me to pick my son up. I have to go to this meeting. I have to do this by Tuesday morning at 4:00. I have to. And when you ask people to challenge what's really behind the have to, it's like, I don't know. I just know that I do.
Yeah.
And therein is the possibility, if you just unpack that a little bit, to say, well, actually, then there will be other choices. And that is, I think, what brings our personal conflict. We were talking before about people having a conflict between their personal purpose and their professional responsibilities. We recruit for high levels of engagement, so we know people are highly engaged, which potentially sets up a conflict between what they want for themselves personally and what they want to achieve for and within their company, for themselves, partly because they want to, we want to contribute, we want to be well thought of by our colleagues, we want to be collegiate, we don't want to let them down. So there's this constant conflict between trying to meet the company objective whilst also meeting your own objectives as a wife, parent, mother, all those other things. And the target that you've set yourself to be marvelous.
Well, this
or
is
brilliant.
Thing, and so there's this, maybe pressure is maybe the wrong word, but we want to develop in a certain way, and we're, for want of a better word, using the organization as a stepping stone in our career, as part of our career story, because we want to achieve certain things. And if those things don't align, or if the organization is not helping us to realize those career goals that we have for ourselves, then that takes away, or that causes a little bit of conflict, maybe. The other thing that occurred to me while you were talking, Lesley, was this idea that so we're kind of saying about the pressures that we put on ourselves, but how do people recognize that? And something that occurred to me is, if you're in the situation and you're saying yes to things, but then you're going off and having a separate conversation with your colleagues saying, oh, I can't believe how much work I have to do, or I can't believe how much work my boss is giving me, or I just have so much. I can't, exactly, like verbalizing those stories. I don't have time to go to the gym. I don't have time to prepare meals, healthy meals, whatever it might be that's going on for you. And is it just a case of stopping and recognizing that either you're telling that to yourself, or you're telling that to your colleagues, or you're complaining about your boss, or you're complaining about the leadership because there's so much pressure, there's so much work that's coming in that you don't have time to get everything done?
Yeah, I think you're quite right. I think if can, it is about checking in with yourself, because sometimes, you know, head down, steaming on, we're the last persons to notice that we're out of the stretch zone and in the strain zone, and potentially heading for burnout. So there's a kind of performance curve, if you like. It's like a bell curve, and at the peak of it, where pressure and coping are in a kind of sweet balance, then you have this, you know, this sweet spot of stretch. But once you start coming out of stretch into strain and overwhelm, you actually lose your ability to be quite as connected to yourself, because you're getting into that zone where you've stopped noticing. It's just head down, default option, plow on. And it's often the case that wives, partners, you know, other people in your life start to notice that you're permanently distracted, what we would call continuously partially present. You're there, but you're not there. And what you, and you know, let's be honest, let's be vulnerable here. We've all been there. It's one of the reasons why I find the topic still so interesting, because it, you know, life is very pressurized, and we do all respond in different ways, and it is lifelong learning and catching yourself, hearing yourself. This is the third time in the last 2 hours I said, I haven't got time for that. I haven't got time for that. It's a story. It's a narrative. So sometimes you're quite right. If you can just listen in for yourself and hear yourself having these conversations, or just be aware that having these conversations with people means something. You know, the need to offload. It's great to share. It's great to have, you know, social contact and support. But what's the quality of the stories that you're telling when you're telling people about that? It is, if you can listen to them and tap into them, it's telling you something about your story. And that there may be some kinks in that, and that you could unravel for yourself, and actually, you know, tell a slightly different story. The old adage, you know, change your story, change your life. That's what that's about. If you keep in a groove, you tend to stay in that groove, and the negativity and the toxicity of it can overwhelm in the end. In the end, you can't see a way out, and that's when burnout becomes a real possibility.
Well, I love the idea that we have a choice, and realizing that we have a choice, and telling yourself that you don't have a choice is actually, you know, challenging yourself on that. I always like to say that we have a choice, and even if you're in a job that you're really miserable, you have a, you know, and talking, I suppose, from a place of privilege here, maybe not everyone necessarily has the choice, but if you reframe your thinking to say, I'm choosing to do this because I need to support my family, I'm choosing to do this because I'm saving money towards doing a qualification that will take me to a better place, whatever it might be. I always like to reframe things to think that, even if you just reframe your thinking to say, I have this choice. I'd love to move on to talk more about this idea of the stress versus the growth aspect, and, you know, in relation to the pressure that we put on ourselves and how we cope with these situations. I like to think of myself as I do thrive under pressure, but maybe it's a case of recognizing when does that pressure become too much, and when do I need to speak up, and when do I need to ask for help, which I think is very difficult for a lot of people, myself included. So maybe let's talk about that there's kind of finding that sweet spot, or how to recognize a sweet spot between you're in this the what was it, the strain versus the
overwhelm. Stretch, strain, and overwhelm. Those are the
stretch versus the strain. And I certainly have been in situations, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, of being totally and utterly overwhelmed. You feel like you have so much to do, you're not sure where to start, you can't see the wood for the trees, and it's really difficult, because I think some of the tips around that are like, focus on one thing, and it's really hard to focus on just one thing when you have so many things to think about. Getting it down on paper, things like that. But for people who kind of thrive under pressure, what becomes the tipping point, or how do we recognize in ourselves when that pressure becomes just a little bit too much?
We've kind of said it already, really, that it's a creeping irritability, I think, is the thing that it's noticeable to other people. And if you're honest, you can kind of see it in yourself, like everyone is an aggravation, everything is a problem, you know. And this is the lovely the good and the bad thing about cognitive landscape, because it's the same comment from a client when you're feeling when you're in stretch is fine. It's energizing. It's lovely. It's it's great that they're asking us this. That means they trust us. They value our opinion. All those wonderful things. If your landscape you've tipped into strain, it's an inconvenience. I don't. Why do they think that our time is completely available to them the whole time? It's the same comment, but it lands in two completely different ways. And they're not to know that, by the way, which is when we come to psychological safety, that's like really worth knowing, because intention and impact is quite hard to second guess, because everybody is different and everybody is in a different place when that lands. So I think watching, the negativity and how am I feeling, just checking in with yourself on a fairly regular basis can help you think, do you know what, everything looks negative, so that probably means I'm out of stretch now, because it all feels very, very different. In terms of like, what do you do about that, and how do you set yourself up to stay in stretch, which is probably worth talking about, because in the end we always want to know, like, what can we do about it, because pressure can, as we've said, creep up on you in a way that if you're so busy and so default into your normal way of doing it, you can't actually be the first person and often the last person to notice that it's affecting you. Is how do you set yourself up so that you can get the better responses more often, and get growth from it rather than stress. And I think that is something around recognizing that we talk a lot with our clients around energy, physical energy, which is the kind of foundation of everything. So that's thinking about what you eat, and obviously the quality of your sleep is sometimes outside of your control if you've got small children, but sleep hygiene, and just recognizing that some of our behaviors later on in the evening may actually undermine our ability to sleep. These are things we have control over. You don't have to drink half a bottle of wine before you go to bed. It's rather nice, perhaps, if you like wine.
But it doesn't help you.
You fall asleep beautifully well, but 2 hours later, ping, you'll be awake until 4 or 5 in the morning. So, these are things that we have control over. So there are certain basic physical, your body has basic physical health needs that we need to attend to. And actually, the busier we get, the less inclined we are to feel we have the time to do exercise, to take the dog out, even if it's a small thing. Not everyone looks good in Lycra, you don't have to be in the gym for hours, but building physical activity into your day every day in some form or other, even if it's taking the stairs or, going out for a 10-15 minute walk at least once during the day has an enormously beneficial effect on your ability to stay. And particularly if you think about, we call it strategic nutrition. We love Mars bars and muffins and all those great things full of sugar, but they do terrible things to your blood sugar, which does terrible things to your emotions. So if you've sat on your chair for 6 hours and all the blood is pooled in the lower part of your body, and you haven't had a posture break, and you haven't moved really any of the major muscle groups in your body, it's your physical body, by the way, that's holding your brain up that is helping you to meet all these demands. So thinking about seeing your body's physical needs and paying attention to them as a contribution to staying in good shape for demands is a really important reframe. As you were talking about reframing, not so I'll get round to exercising when I'm caught up, when I finish my inbox. So actually, you're more likely to be able to tackle the contents of your inbox if you're meeting your body's basic physical needs around movement, nutrition, hydration, and sleep. So that's something to consider. And these things are within our control. They are choices, but we have narratives that tell us we can't take them. Hence the impact of narratives that don't help you. But for me, the big one is that what's sitting on top of that is the kind of emotional energy piece. So much of our emotion is negative, and we're far more likely to fall into a kind of negativity mode when we haven't eaten anything all day, or we've eaten something that was full of sugar, and then 60 minutes later it falls out of your bloodstream, and suddenly you just feel either psychotic or depressed or anxious or whatever. Our emotional stability is very closely linked to blood sugar. So maintaining the right sort of nutrition during the day, eating little and often, staying off sugary stuff. These are really practical things that people can do for themselves. When you have your emotional energy under control, then you can focus. You can choose, which is why it's a long way into a simple answer. You can choose your cognitive response to things, and you can choose what you focus on when you've got your emotions under control. It's almost impossible to do that, to your point, if you're emotionally triggered in any way. And if you're triggered, it'll invariably throw you in the negative side of emotions rather than the positive ones, obviously. And so that's why it's really important to attend to the basics. And these things, again, are absolutely within our grasp as individuals, but you do kind of also need permission from your company to prioritize these things. And that, I'm not going to go to this meeting because I have been in 6 back-to-back meetings today. I'll be physically present, but emotionally and mentally simply not there. So I'm not coming.
Yeah.
And that your boss or your colleagues say, good for you, go and recover. Come back when you can contribute something. It's a mindset change.
And we'll get on to that in a second, but I just kind of wanted to wrap up what we were talking about here. And vulnerable share here, but in early 2022 I talked about well-being at work and how important it was. I had COVID at the tail end of 2021 and I was sort of recovering at the early part of 2022, but still, later in 2022 I neglected my health and I didn't make it a priority. And I think really it's about prioritizing those things and thinking about the finite time that we have every day. And so the start of 2023, I'm doing there's a Twitter challenge called the hashtag 100 days of walking. And so I'm making sure to get out for a walk, 30-minute walk, at least 30-minute walk every day. I'm doing the yoga challenge with Adrian every day as well. And then just from a switching off perspective in the evening, I'm working remotely in Tenerife at the moment, which is incredible. But you don't necessarily get these opportunities in Dublin, in Ireland in general. But to go down to watch the sunset every evening at 6:30 and just take that time out and just kind of refresh and relax. And even thinking at the back end of 2022, where I felt guilty if I was working and felt guilty if I wasn't working when I was in Tenerife, and there is so many wonderful things to enjoy. But it's about bringing that back and knowing what is important to prioritize. And we always learned the Maslow hierarchy of needs. We're not supposed to talk about that, and it wasn't supposed to be a pyramid at all. But if you're thinking about the prioritization of what you need on a day-to-day basis, I think it comes back exactly to what you said, Lesley. It's prioritizing the physical side of things, so that physical movement, nutrition, sleep, not having too much sugar, which therefore helps you emotionally regulate and not get triggered by specific things. And we talked about kind of triggering things on one of the previous podcast episodes with Ashley Collins, which was super interesting. But I think taking the holistic view of saying, if we don't actually, if we treat ourselves physically well, then we are less likely to get triggered by whatever is coming up in our work, absolutely, in our emotional journey. So I love that. And again, this idea of choice, being able to choose that cognitive response that we're having. But coming back to this idea now of the kind of wider environment that we find ourselves in, and creating that space where it's okay to say, listen, I've actually been in six back-to-back meetings today, so I'm going to skip this one out because I really won't have anything to contribute. I'm just not feeling it right now. But how do we get there? And I suppose what prevents leaders from creating that type of environment?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's changing now, thank goodness. We've been talking about this for several years, and at the beginning it was, as somebody said, a bit like pushing water uphill with a fork. It's like it's so obvious to us, but then we are steeped in this, and it's what we spent our life talking about and thinking about. But what's changing is that companies are and leaders, individual leaders, and sometimes whole organizational boards are really understanding the relationships and the dynamics between well-being and performance. What creates good well-being creates the conditions for people to perform at their best in a sustainable way, which of course is what everybody wants, because we need more from our employees without killing them or making them sick. So, that is it's an interesting conversation that they want to have. How do we create things and create the environment where people can be at their perfect 10 every day? But then, be able to fulfill their own purpose as well as help us meet ours, and hopefully those two purposes kind of align. So it is a cultural thing around helping leaders in particular, I think, have to kind of lead from the front with this one, to create an environment where people, the whole team, understands why this stuff matters. I know it sounds very simple to say it. Wellbeing as a concept has been around for so long, but do people really understand why it makes such a difference? When people perform well, why are they performing well? What are they bringing in to the workplace? And what are the conditions necessary for them to be able to bring their full self to work? And of course, the answer is that they have to feel safe to be themselves. If they feel they have to have different persona and a work mask, then you're just as when you place a ceramic mask on the front of a human, you can still see the human, but the person has changed. You're not getting to see the full person. And we say a lot, when you employ someone, the whole person comes, not just the bit that does the job. But sometimes we don't bring all of it. We leave a little bit of it back, and it's that full person presence, that ability to really access all of those brains in an open and trusting environment, that can actually release so much, not just discretionary effort. I mean, there's not a lot of discretionary effort left, to be honest, in my opinion. I think most people are leaving it all out on the pitch anyway. But it's that ability to feed into the conversation, into the collaboration, an idea or a thought or an insight that could just be massively catalytic, that if it was not shared, that's a loss to the organization. You don't know you've lost it, of course, but you have lost it. So I think there is a lot to be said for working with leadership to really help, and individuals as well, to understand what makes you stellar. When you're stellar, if you're honest, develop self-awareness as well. What are the conditions needed for people to be fully themselves and to be fully present, and for us to get the best out of ourselves and each other every day? It's all the things we already know about a sense of belonging, a sense of being valued, a sense of being able to be yourself without fear of negative consequences. Working in an environment where it's okay to make a mistake, because it's genuinely understood by everyone in the team, not tolerated, by the way, different. Candor is expected. Amy Edmondson, I'm probably familiar with her work from Harvard, has done so much work in this area, and she says, candor is expected. I mean, it's just a great phrase. Like, I want you to tell me the truth. I want you to tell me something different to what I think, because otherwise I'm just hearing what I think. And that's, as a leader, I want to hear an opposite view. I want to hear someone have a different perspective, because that enables me to challenge my own perspective and say, actually, am I looking at this the right way? Are we, we're three of us are seeing it like this, but one of us is seeing it like that. That's really interesting. That casts some light that we can use. But it doesn't happen overnight, because people have to trust each other. Yeah. Because we're all very risk averse for all sorts of good reasons. We have a bias for threat. And if we feel in any way that we're vulnerable, or, by doing or saying or contributing in this way, I'm taking an interpersonal risk that could have negative consequences for me, we will default to, I'll wait and see. I won't say, which is fine. It may come out eventually, but we're in a do more with less environment, so we need it now. And of course, the benefit of being able to be that open and that honest is happiness, because it's exhausting thinking one thing but saying something else, or smiling and waving. Absolutely. I quite agree with that. It's wonderful to be in a collaboration where with your leader or your other team members, where you can just really get in there and get it talked about. And I think that's the root. And then we'll talk about happiness at work. That's the root of happiness and sustainable well-being, when people feel able to contribute like that, because then when they're struggling, it's easy to say, do you know what, I can't do this today. I need I need to, I'm done, and everyone goes, yeah, get it, understand that completely, go, come back. Very different to the environment that most of us have grown up in, and many of us are still working in, because it's all a little bit less certain that it's safe to do that.
I'd love to come back to this idea that it kind of seems like a very first step, but it's to educate people, just the general kind of working population, why well-being is important. And I feel like that step has nearly been missed, where when I was still working in corporate, we had a well-being week once a year, and that was kind of it. Now I think things have moved on a little bit now, so that would have been probably about 6 years ago. Things have moved on a little bit now, and I see lots of really great initiatives, but I also wonder, is it a box ticking still, or do they educate people on why the well-being side of things is important? I personally always made time during Wellbeing Week to attend the various talks that we had on. But if people knew the importance of looking after themselves first in order to perform at their best, and I love this second point of what makes you stellar and what makes you perform your best, and when you can perform your best, you feel really, really great as well. So it's kind of taking that step back and looking at it from the perspective of the individual and saying, do you know why it's important to be well so that you can perform well at work?
Yeah, and that's where we started, is understanding the pennies dropping about the relationship between well-being and performance. Well-being is not still in many cases, unfortunately, a commodity solution. We're going to drive you really hard. She's probably, can't tell it any other way than it is. We're going to drive you really hard. We have fractionally fewer people here than we actually need. We know that as a leadership team, but we've got to keep the profits high, so we keep the overheads low. And we are going to trade on the goodwill of the staff, knowing that they will go the extra mile. They'll find the time, and that's how we can have. Nobody actually says this, by the way, but but this is the model that we're working in. There is too much work to do, and the stress statistics will tell you that. And people are navigating this currently by extending the working day and eating into recovery time that is really, really important for them to maintain themselves at the level they need to be to perform. And so I think that, understanding that well-being cannot be offered. I mean, as you say, a wellness sabbatical is like, what is that about? That's like saying, this is okay, but we're going to give you a week where you can pay a little bit more attention to, taking your dog out and going for a run or something like that. It's not a commodity solution. It has to be integrated into the way that you work. And that is only achievable if people genuinely understand, where does performance come from? Where does the brainwave come from? Where does the engagement come from? It comes from people being physically, having enough ticks in the boxes physically to keep themselves emotionally able to engage in a stable way, and then being able to make the right choices in relation to how they use themselves. Because to your earlier point, and we say this quite a lot, if you're any good, and anyone who's in a job these days is pretty good, because you wouldn't be in a job if you weren't contributing, because there's just no company where you can work and not contribute. Demand will always exceed supply. If you're any good, people will want more of what you have than you have time and energy to respond. And what we tend to do is just go to the loudest voice, or try and go faster, or expend the working day. But the reality is, we have to choose. What do you give your attention to? And then what is the quality of the attention that you're given? And that's where the last piece of the energy pyramid is really important, is like purpose. What is the purpose of me within this organization, or what is the purpose of the team that I work on, so that we've got a fighting chance of being able to choose which tasks are urgent and important, but also to know that there are tasks that are important but not urgent, so maybe we can negotiate about those, but also tasks that are not particularly important but they're easy to do, and they're energizing, so that we can start to separate this blob of demand and segregate it into different things that we can use strategically or attend to strategically. But the point is, it's back to what you said about choice, recognizing that there's too much of it. So just going faster or working 24 hours a day is just not going to be possible. So at some stage or other, you have to prioritize, and knowing as a team or an individual what your goal is, either personally or professionally or both, helps people to make the right decisions in relation to what they give their time and attention to. And then also the quality of the attention that they're giving, because this is back to what we said before, because we're not having that conversation with ourselves very often. We're continually partially present on 10 things at once. And so when you're told to focus, it's like, yeah, I get that, but how?
Yeah,
I've got 10 people telling me, do it now. It's urgent and important. So the individual needs to be able to make that choice for themselves relative to what's important, what they think their personal goal is or what their professional goal is. But it's impossible to do that if you're emotionally triggered. So we're back to, well-being, seeing, understanding. Our mantra, always the thing that excites us the most, is when you do workshops or training with groups of people and they get it. They suddenly see that, oh, I'm kind of multi-layered, and there are things I can do in each one of these layers. They're not big, they're not complicated. I don't have to kind of, become a different person, but there are very specific things that I can do in each of these categories, which all build on each other, that will help me improve my well-being. And when I've got that, I can perform at the highest level indefinitely without fear of burnout. That's quite a sort of engaging proposition for individuals. And talk to a leader about creating that in their team, creating that level of awareness and team join up to supporting each other in these activities. Suddenly you can see the pound signs. Oh, I get it. Oh yeah, there is a way to do more with less without damaging people in the process. And that's the joy of energy management, as it's generally, it's not about competency. Everyone's competent in their job. It's about helping the competent people create the capacity to contribute in a sustainable way whilst not damaging their well-being. Sounds like nirvana.
It does. And
shame we can't put it in a bottle.
we didn't kind of, and I didn't think that we would get here, but burnout is the obvious kind of outcome of that. And I have touched on that topic in the past on the podcast episode with Lindsay Recknell. But that is the kind of the obvious outcome of that sustained not looking after yourself, overworking, working all the additional hours because the companies are deliberately under-resourced, essentially. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that. Lesley, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast: what does being happier at work mean to you?
It means feeling safe to be yourself, without a question, for me, because there are so many benefits for the organization and for being self-actualized, if we're talking about the top of the triangle. In feeling you've made a contribution, feeling that your opinion is personally valid, that you have an opinion, you feel safe to share it, and that people give you positive feedback about that. Or if they don't agree with it, they tell you why they don't agree with it, and you can have an open and adult conversation rather than sitting in fear that, I'm not speaking up, I'm not making a contribution. I'm a bit sort of, Hobson's choice. If I don't say anything, I feel like I'm being judged for not making a contribution. If I do make a contribution, I fear it's going to be considered to be stupid. So, or there'll be negative consequences of sharing it because actually I don't agree with you guys. I think we're all going down the wrong path. I think it'll be a disaster and a waste of resources. But do you know what? I don't feel safe enough to tell you that. So I'm not going to say anything. Talk about rock hard play. So ultimately it all comes down to feeling safe to be yourself, because then it's easy to manage your well-being. You can say, do you know what, I'm done. I just I'm a very engaged and willing person, but my brain is fried. I need to go and watch my son play rugby, and I'll be back tomorrow and not feel judged. It all comes back to this safety, feeling psychologically safe at work.
Brilliant. And if people want to reach out, if they want to connect and find out more about what you do, what's the best place or what's the best way they can do that?
Oh, well, we have a website, www.workingwell.co.uk, which has got all the links to all the things that we do on it. We're writing a book at the moment, actually. This has been going on for quite some time, but because work gets in the way of actually writing things down. So we hope we have a new book coming out called Brave, how to create a psychologically safe workspace, coming out at the end of the year. So we'll keep a lookout for that. And if on the website there is the usual contact, I mean, hopefully there's stuff on there that we find interesting anyway. But if you did need to reach out to us, it's just team@workingwell.co.uk.
Brilliant.
One of us will be there.
That's great. Thanks so much, Lesley. Really, really appreciate your time today. And I think really interesting and practical things that people can do on an individual level, as well as a more of a kind of organizational level as well, to address these issues in relation to well-being at work. So thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.